Welcome to this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. Today I speak to Dr. Sophie Lund Rassmusen. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit at the University of Oxford. Sophie has developed a global reputation of being one of the leading researchers working on hedgehogs. During her PhD, she started the Danish Hedgehog Project to study how hedgehogs are faring in urban landscapes. She has since expanded her work significantly. In this episode, she talks about her PhD and all her other research work which has followed. We also talk about hedgehog conservation at a global scale. Tune in to listen more. Before we start the episode, do not forget to subscribe to the podcast. This is completely free, although there is an optional paid subscription model on Substack and YouTube. The podcast will never be behind a paywall, although the paid subscription will help me expand the podcast significantly in the next couple of years. Additionally, 30% of the revenue will be donated to wildlife NGOs. The revenues from this episode will be donated to WildCRU to support their research on hedgehogs around the world. Now, let's start the episode and learn about hedgehogs and all the great work Sophie is doing to conserve them. Welcome to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today to talk about hedgehogs.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I love to talk about hedgehogs.
So, what got you interested in hedgehogs? And just talk about your career so far and all the work, and just briefly talk about some of the work you've done with hedgehogs.
So basically, I've always loved hedgehogs. I find them extremely fascinating. They're like these mystical creatures roaming around at night, sniffing on the ground. And I remember from my childhood that I would stay up late in the summer month, during my holiday, and I would put up a tent in the garden and just wait for the hedgehogs to appear. And then I would feed them water and food, and would just be waiting for them to come because I think they're really fascinating. They're one of the few wildlife species that you can actually get very close to. I mean, they curl up or they stand completely still when they're faced with danger. And if they decide to run away, they don't run that fast. So you can actually really interact with the hedgehogs. And I think that's what just made me love hedgehogs from the very beginning. When I then decided to study biology, I discovered that the hedgehogs were really neglected in terms of research. I would have assumed that a species which is so popular, everybody loves hedgehogs, would have been, researched properly, that we would know all about the hedgehogs. But that's actually not the case. And then I thought, okay, I can really make a difference if I focus my research efforts on discovering the ecology of the European hedgehog, why it's facing this decline, what we can do to mitigate this, and actually actively help the hedgehog survive in the wild. So that was my career path, unraveling, and that was wonderful.
So, how many species of hedgehogs are there in the world and where are they found?
So right now, we're up to around 19 species of hedgehogs. A new species was discovered in China last year, and I think it's counted as part of the whole family now. So around 19 species. And they're found throughout the world, across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Central Asia. But there are no hedgehogs native to Australia, and no living species native to the Americas right now. The hedgehogs are present in New Zealand, for example, but that's the European hedgehog because the Brits introduced the hedgehog back in 1870s, and it's now considered a pest actually in New Zealand because of the lack of natural predators. So it's a completely different situation than in Europe, where we have the European hedgehog, and it's actually in severe decline right now.
So you mentioned that the hedgehogs are in decline. What are some of the key threats to hedgehogs as a family of species, subspecies?
Well, I mean, hedgehogs in general are, of course, affected by human activity. So it's more or less all anthropogenic causes for decline. And for the European hedgehog, which I specialize in, the decline is caused by a multitude of different factors. And some we may not even have discovered yet. We're trying to figure out what is causing the decline. This is what my research is all about, to really investigate the decline, the factors contributing to this, and what we can do to stop the decline. But in general terms, it's of course traffic. Our landscape is completely fragmented by all these different roads, and we have a lot of cars. And it's estimated that up to 1/3 of the population is killed on roads every year. So cars is, of course, a huge problem. But it's also the intensified agricultural practices that makes it hard to be a hedgehog today, because the fields are getting larger and larger. So all the natural habitats for the hedgehogs, the hedgerows that would surround the fields originally and create nest sites for hedgehogs, have been removed. And the intensified agricultural practices also include a lot of pesticide use. And of course, when you use pesticides, you kill all the insects, for example, that the hedgehogs feed on. And you also kill a lot of, weed plants that you don't want in your crops. And that creates like a monoculture in a large area where you only grow one crop, and that doesn't really attract biodiversity to the same extent as like a natural wild area. So this means that the hedgehogs have trouble finding enough food to eat the insects and slugs and snails they primarily eat, and they have no nest sites left. And then, of course, there are also a lot of very large, heavy machinery on on the fields, and these may also injure the hedgehogs. We don't know that. And then, in general, the use of poisons also in our gardens is a problem. I just published a study showing that 84% of the hedgehogs we tested, these were dead hedgehogs, road-killed hedgehogs, they had rodenticides in their liver, 84% of them. And half of them had insecticides and herbicides in their system. So they're really affected by the use of poisons. And then, of course, it's also challenging for the hedgehogs to find mates as the species is declining. It's harder for them to find mates. And when they have to cross all these roads, they might get isolated in small, like local populations. And this could contribute to the degree of inbreeding we see, for example, in Denmark. And we all know that inbreeding is not good for a population. So there are a lot of different things going on for the hedgehogs.
So you mentioned about road kills. So talk about what exactly is a hedgehog highway and talk about this project.
Yes. So research has now discovered that the decline of hedgehogs is most severe in the rural areas. Then there it's estimated in the UK that up to 75% of the hedgehogs have gone since the turn of the century. So that's 3 out of 4 hedgehogs gone. But this also means that the hedgehogs are increasingly seeking areas of human activity and occupation for their habitats. So due to all the habitat loss going on, they are actually living in our gardens right now. And therefore, it's really important that we do keep hedgehogs in mind when we are designing our gardens, because in the UK especially, there's a tendency for gardens to be completely closed by tall, massive fences. And if you have a hedgehog-friendly garden, but the hedgehogs can't enter the garden, it's of course completely ridiculous. And the hedgehogs are actually struggling to roam around freely in the residential areas where they live nowadays because there is no access to these gardens. And this is why the concept of hedgehog highways has been invented. It's basically to cut a hole in your fence to ensure that the hedgehogs can roam around freely in their search for food and mates.
So talk about some of the research you are doing on urban hedgehogs and how this can contribute to their conservation.
Yes, so I've focused my work on urban hedgehogs, and that's because research has shown that the fight to survive and preserve the hedgehogs in the wild is going to take place in our gardens, in our residential gardens. This is where the hedgehogs live nowadays. So that's why it's really important to uncover all the questions we have about their survival in urban areas. So which threats do they face when living in suburbia? And what can we do to prevent this decline of hedgehogs in the suburban areas? And previously, there were not a lot of studies available, almost none, about hedgehogs in the suburbs. And I quickly understood why. Because the hedgehogs are nocturnal. And when you then have to study them actively, you can use radio trackers, for example. So you can attach small radio tags to their spines with glue, allowing them to move freely. And then you can follow the hedgehogs and really discover how they live, what they do, what their ecology is like, and which threats they face. So this was what I did back in 2014. Back then, GPS tags were not really available. So we used radio tags and we had to radio track the hedgehogs. So I would walk around at nighttime wearing a head torch, a large backpack, and a large antenna. And I would walk around in residential areas, and that looked very suspicious. I mean, people would react to that. They would go, "Who are you? What are you doing?" And I would try to explain that I was a hedgehog researcher. And as you can imagine, there are not a lot of hedgehog researchers around, so people were really suspicious. So I actually got on a front name basis with the local police officers because they were called out several times. Because it was just so strange to have me running around with that large antenna and torch and everything, peeping into people's gardens, trying to find my hedgehogs. But what I did was that I radio tracked 35 juvenile hedgehogs and followed them for the first year of their life. So I would attach the tag to their spines when they were ready to leave their mothers and they became independent. And I followed them almost every night for a whole year to see whether they survived and how far they moved around and which challenges they faced. And that was really, that was a lot of hard work because I was out every night. And when they started hibernating, and they did that very late that year, so it was in December in Denmark, I would follow them like once a week to check whether they had changed nests. And then when they woke up again, I was ready to follow them from around April. So what my research discovered was that the survival of these juvenile hedgehogs in the suburbs of Copenhagen was actually quite high. I mean, in general, around 70% of them survived for their first year of life. And that was, of course, really nice to know because we were worried that a lot of them would actually die before their first hibernation. And if they survive the first year of life, they'll be ready to mate and contribute to the survival of the population. So that's good. What I also discovered was that they were really adaptable. So they made nests the strangest places. They like to sleep under like wooden terraces, for example, and some of them also slept in piles of litter. Like a paint bucket that was empty, but it was like leaning up against a wall. And then the hedgehog would actually isolate this paint bucket with different materials like leaves, but also worn garden gloves and a flat football. But it was a brilliant hedgehog because it knew that the house wall would actually emit heat. So it was really smart of that hedgehog. So they adapted to the urban environment. So even though people's gardens were perhaps not really suitable for hedgehogs, and that is a problem. If you have short grass and just, garden tiles and no biodiversity in your garden, there's nothing for the hedgehogs to eat. There would be no places to sleep. But the hedgehogs managed to find other solutions. So nesting underneath wooden terraces or playhouses or garden sheds, for example. So I was glad to see that even though it's a bit sad that they have to adapt like that and not have like natural nests, they could actually survive. But what we discovered, what was most surprising to me was that the most typical type of injury and cause of death for the hedgehogs in my study was actually dog attacks. So dogs living in residential gardens may attack the hedgehogs. Some don't, of course, but some do. And we lost several hedgehogs to dog attacks and fox attacks in the suburban areas. We may have also lost some to traffic, but unfortunately, some of the radio tags just disappeared. The signal vanished, and I couldn't retrieve the hedgehogs. And the teenage hedgehogs I was following, they also changed their spines into adult spines, which meant that some of them actually just lost their tags. So I would find the tag lying on the ground because the hedgehogs had shed their spines and then lost the tag. So unfortunately, some of these individuals couldn't be accounted for. But I was surprised to see that the most common cause of death for these hedgehogs was actually dog and fox attacks.
So since you spoke about your research in Copenhagen, talk about the Denmark Hedgehog Project, the Danish Hedgehog Project.
Yes, so I'm leading the Danish Hedgehog Project, and that was essentially my PhD project, which ran from 2016 to 2019. And I decided that I would use dead hedgehogs to understand the living. Because every time my husband and I would be driving a car and we would pass by a flat road-killed hedgehog, I would get very upset. And then he said to me at some point, well, why don't you use the dead hedgehogs for something good then? Can't they somehow help the living hedgehogs? And I thought, that's a brilliant idea because then we can answer all the questions we cannot answer by looking at the live hedgehogs. So we can do necropsies, we can take out the organs, we can investigate the organs. So what I did back in 2016 was to ask the Danish citizens to collect dead hedgehogs for my research. So they wouldn't have died in vain, you could say. Of course, when a hedgehog dies, it enters the circle of life, so the scavengers would eat it and get some food and nutrition out of the dead hedgehog. But still, I thought that by using the dead hedgehogs to understand the living, we could actually make a difference for the hedgehogs. So I asked the Danish citizens to collect dead hedgehogs for my research, and there was a huge support for this. I mean, everybody wanted to contribute because everybody loves hedgehogs. So actually being able to help out and secure the future of the hedgehogs was a huge motivation for people. So I ended up with 697 dead hedgehogs collected from all over Denmark. And people would drive for hours to the nearest collection station with a stinky, rotten hedgehog in their car to deliver it. It was absolutely amazing. And this is a wonderful data set because we have the whole country represented, the whole Danish country, all sorts of areas in Denmark. And we did the necropsies. I mean, I had 4 student assistants, and it took us almost 2 years to necropsy all these hedgehogs. But we took out all the organs we could and saved them all in freezers. the hedgehogs alone took up like 14 large freezers in space, and now I have like a whole freezer room full of hedgehog organs, which I use for my research. So ever since 2016, I've been using all these different samples from the hedgehogs to investigate a lot of different subjects. So we've done research on the genetics of the hedgehogs, and it turns out the Danish hedgehogs are very inbred compared to the rest of Europe. And that might be due to the fact that Denmark mainly consists of islands. And the hedgehog populations, we can see genetically that they're just isolated on these islands, because even though hedgehogs are excellent swimmers, they might not cross, the sea between the islands. That's a bit challenging. And some of the bridges connecting the Danish islands are pretty long. So they're not mixing. But that was really interesting to see. We've also done research into the toxicology, as I mentioned before. So we used the hedgehog livers to look at the accumulation of pesticides in the Danish hedgehog population, and that was really serious. And we've also looked into their microbiomes. So basically all the different bacteria the hedgehogs carry, both the good and the bad, to discover which diseases we should be aware of in terms of potential disease transmission between hedgehogs and humans, but also whenever a hedgehog is admitted into care at a wildlife rehabilitation center, which infectious diseases might they carry? Then it gets easier for the different rehabilitators to target the treatment with antibiotics. If we can say that, for example, Salmonella is the most common pathogen that would cause disease in the hedgehogs. But we haven't published this yet. It'll be out soon, and I look forward to presenting the results. We've also looked at their endoparasites, their dental health. A lot of different research has been done on this, and it's just a gift that keeps giving, because I still have a lot of organs left. We're also looking at the kidneys now to see whether hedgehogs have kidney disease, and we're using the fecal samples to study what the diets of the hedgehogs is. So basically using eDNA to determine exactly what the hedgehogs have been eating. Because one of the reasons why they're declining could be the fact that the insects are disappearing, right? We've all heard about this, the sixth mass extinction. And if the natural food items of the hedgehogs are disappearing, what are they surviving on? So it's really important to try and discover what they're actually eating nowadays, because this could also indicate how we can best help them. So, but I still have a lot of tasks to do, a lot of projects to do, and thankfully a lot of hedgehog material in the freezer to do it.
So, what are some of the hedgehog conservation projects going around the world?
So I established a conservation program in Denmark with the World Wildlife Fund. It's called Denmark's Hedgehogs, and we've been running it for just over a year now. And what we're doing is to inform people how they can actually make their gardens hedgehog friendly. I think that's one of the most important things we can do in terms of conservation. Teach people how to look out for the hedgehogs and make sure that their gardens are suitable habitats for the hedgehogs. And then we arrange an annual hedgehog count, where we basically ask the Danish citizens to count hedgehogs on the second Saturday of August every year, so that we can map their presence and absence. And in the long run, when we have sufficient data, say something clever about the population decline or increase and how the population is doing. And in the UK, we have Hedgehog Street. It's been running for over 10 years now, and it's also informing citizens about how to make their gardens hedgehog friendly. People can also map the hedgehogs there in their system, and they have a concept called is it called Hedgehog Heroes or something like that? But people can sign up to become like a hedgehog champion, it's called. And they have over 100,000 hedgehog champions. So that's also really important because the hedgehog champions actively do their best to preserve the hedgehogs in their local areas, making their gardens wildlife friendly, spreading the word about protecting the hedgehogs. So that's excellent. And I also know of conservation campaigns in the Netherlands, in Germany, for example, and hopefully a lot of other countries will start their own conservation campaigns as well, because it is really important, and we need to educate people. We need to inspire them and engage them in hedgehog conservation in their own backyards, because this is where we're going to save the hedgehogs.
So what have been some of your most prominent challenges and most memorable moments from your academia and conservation career?
It's always very challenging to find funding to study hedgehogs. And I mean, you wouldn't imagine that, right? Because the hedgehogs are just so popular. In the UK, they've been voted UK's favorite mammal, and also like the national animal for the UK, and people really love hedgehogs. But when it comes to funding hedgehog research, it's a completely different story. And that is very challenging. So I'm really struggling to find funding for my research, basically. And I hope that someday a rich philanthropist thinks that, oh, I have to support Sophie's work. It's so important, so that I could get my own hedgehog sponsor. But for now, it's the largest challenge is actually to find funding for the research I do, because we can get a lot of samples for the research. Whenever I ask the citizens through citizen science or the hedgehog carers to help collect samples, I get a lot. But we still need the funding to process all these samples and answer all the questions we want to answer. But I was actually, so the most surprising moment I've had with my research so far was actually when I decided to study the effects of robotic lawnmowers on hedgehogs. Because from around 2016, stories started showing up in the media about robotic lawnmowers and hedgehogs, how robotic lawnmowers could injure hedgehogs. And nobody had actually studied that. So it was completely anecdotal, and the media just loved that story. And it spread all over Denmark and Sweden and Norway and Germany, where they had a lot of robotic lawnmowers. I mean, they are very popular, and they're also coming to the UK now. And the journalist would ask me as a hedgehog expert, so what do you think about this? And I just had a really hard time imagining that a robotic lawnmower would injure the hedgehog, because first of all, I had a robotic vacuum cleaner in my house, and I was really impressed how this managed to navigate between all my son's toys without running the toys over and without like vacuuming the socks lying on the floor and so on. So I thought that the technology of the robotic lawnmower would be the same, that it would actually avoid the hedgehogs. But I decided to investigate this properly to see whether or not it was actually a challenge, because if the hedgehogs are residing in our backyards and people have robotic lawnmowers and the hedgehog population is declining, we of course have to do something about it if the robotic lawnmowers injured the hedgehogs. So I decided to test this by basically running over a lot of dead hedgehogs with robotic lawnmowers to see the effects. So I asked the hedgehog carers to collect all the hedgehogs dying in their care. You know, they died from injury or disease, and they were going to basically be lost anyway. I asked them to collect these hedgehogs for me, the dead hedgehogs, so I could use them for my research. And I was really shocked to see that some of the robotic lawnmowers really did injure the dead hedgehogs we tested. Some didn't, but some did. And I really, really love hedgehogs. I'm passionate about hedgehogs. So it was horrible to witness the damage caused to these hedgehogs' cadavers. And at that moment, I decided I'm going to change this. I'm going to change that situation. We have to make sure that the robotic lawnmowers on the market are not injuring the hedgehogs. So I was fortunate to be able to set up a research project supported by the industry, by Husqvarna and Stihl, and they are some of the major manufacturers of robotic lawnmowers. We've set up this wonderful collaboration where we develop hedgehog-friendly robotic lawnmowers. And we've even developed a hedgehog crash test dummy that can be 3D printed so that we can test the machines without using actual dead hedgehogs. And these dummies will also allow the other manufacturers to test their products also in the development phase of a new product, ensuring that they are hedgehog friendly. We've also developed a safety test, like a standardized safety test. How do you measure whether a robotic lawnmower is actually hedgehog friendly? We've developed this test, and hopefully we'll have this test implemented in part of a testing protocol that will approve the robotic lawnmowers for sale on the market, so that they will have to pass this hedgehog friendliness test. And this will hopefully lead to a labeling system that would actually guide the consumers into buying the hedgehog-friendly robotic lawnmowers. But yes, that was really, I mean, shocking for me to discover that some of the models could actually injure the hedgehogs. And you could argue that, okay, how big is that problem? Because the hedgehogs are nocturnal, they're active during nighttime, and the robotic lawnmowers are usually running during daytime. And couldn't you just solve the problem by letting them run during the day? But the thing is that some people actually prefer to let their robotic lawnmowers run during nighttime because they're not using the garden at night. So it's really convenient that they're running at nighttime. And this is, of course, when the risk of bumping into a hedgehog is highest. However, hedgehogs are sometimes active during the day. And this is why the work to develop hedgehog-friendly robotic lawnmowers is especially important, because they may sometimes encounter robotic lawnmowers during the day. And this is, for example, when during the breeding season, when the hoglets, the juvenile hedgehogs, they're called hoglets, they get out of the nest and start exploring their area with their mothers. The mothers take them out and teach them how to survive in the wild, how to forage and so on, from the age of around 3 to 4 weeks, and then until they reach an age about 6 weeks when they become independent. And this often happens during daytime. And this is when they might encounter a robotic lawnmower in action. And the small hoglets, they're very naive and they're very inquisitive. So this is actually very problematic because they wouldn't run away necessarily from a robotic lawnmower. So this is really important work, because even though the robotic lawnmowers are not at all causing the largest threat to hedgehog survival, it's something we can actively do something about. I mean, I'm collaborating with the industry. We're solving this issue. And that's one thing less to worry about for the hedgehogs then. And I really like that you discover a challenge and you solve the problem with the research, very practical solutions. So that is great. And I'm really thrilled about this work.
So that is the final question I had for you today. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking to you and learning about hedgehogs.
Thank you for inviting me.
We have reached the end of this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. If you are still listening, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast and learned something new about conservation. Feel free to leave your thoughts on the episode and don't forget to share and subscribe. Before we end the podcast, I would like to share another podcast on Indian wildlife called The Thing About Wildlife by Ishika Ramakrishna. Also, for those who would like to learn more about conservation in India, I have attached a link to 3 books on Indian wildlife, which I highly recommend. One is a field guide to the mammals of India by Vivek Menon, which is by far one of the most detailed field guides I have seen from anywhere in the world. The second is titled At the Feet of Living Things, written by the various conservationists at the Nature Conservation Foundation. It covers 25 years of the organization's research, ranging from the conservation of snow leopards in Spiti Valley to rainforest restoration in Annamalai and dugong conservation in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The final is a 4-part series by Mr. H.S. Babla, a former Indian Forest Service officer, which provides a very in-depth analysis of the state of India's conservation and the way forward. It covers species reintroduction, wildlife tourism, the forest rights, and poaching. He also talks about his time as an officer heading various conservation projects in Madhya Pradesh, ranging from the reintroduction of Barasinga and blackbuck to the gore and tackling the Panna poaching crisis. And with that, we end this episode of Think Wildlife Podcast. Thank you once again.